Kissinger was the best book you've ever written is because, as you said, it constructed on a foundation of prodigious research. The bibliography is impressive, right?
Right.
You have the privilege to get access to almost every part of his life, vast archives,
yes,
government documentaries, personal letters, diaries, memos, whatever it is. But how to deal with so many tons of documents? How to figure out which is true and which is the important part?
Well, the challenge for an historian is partly just data management, particularly if you're working on modern history. The period of Henry Kissinger's life, he's turning 95 this very month, is a time when documents were much easier to produce and to preserve than in the past. So there's a massive amount of stuff, typewritten documents, Xeroxed documents, transcripts of recorded telephone calls. It's an immense amount of material, and I've been trying my hardest to be very thorough. In other words, I didn't just want to look at Kissinger's own papers, though that was certainly a very important part of the research. I wanted to look at him from multiple angles, from foreign archives as well as from American archives.
Yeah.
What I ended up with tens of thousands of pages of material, and I sometimes find myself wondering if my life will be long enough to work my way through all the material. But that's what you have to do. The historian's challenge is to take 10,000 pages and boil it down to perhaps 1,000 pages. And that's really the essence of what a serious historian does. It's what you might call distillation. One's distilling the material into its essence.
But it's an authorized biography.
That's one of these words that has different meanings for different people.
For you,
the
what does that
idea
mean?
was Kissinger's. It was Henry Kissinger who suggested to me now, I think 15 years ago, that I might write this book. And when he suggested that I might write his biography, I was hesitant because I knew it would be a lot of work. And I also knew that there are a lot of people who have made up their minds about Henry Kissinger, and nothing I
So what's
write
the stereotype
will change them.
image
Well, I think
of Kissinger in people's minds?
There's a soft version of it which says he's a realist, a cynical believer in power politics, and then there's a hard version, a left-wing version, which says he's an evil war criminal. And people who perhaps grew up during the time of the anti-Vietnam War protests have made up their minds on that subject. And I thought to myself, whatever I write, there are a lot of people who are just not going to change their minds. So I hesitated, but he persuaded me, and that took two forms. One, he made it clear that I would have access to his private papers, which nobody else had done. And secondly, and crucially, he agreed that I would have complete independence and would be able to write whatever I wanted. And I wouldn't have done it otherwise.
But what does that mean? Those times you spent with him, like conversation with him, supping with him, and traveling with him, this is a sort of kind of a special treat. I mean, during this like sort of interactive, did you feel like this person is slightly different from the stereotype image people usually tend to think about him? That's why the subtitle of the book is The Idealist, which astonished most of the people.
Yes, almost as soon as I started working my way through the letters and diaries and the memoranda in his private papers, I noticed that he wasn't the person I had been expecting. When I started the project, I thought it was going to be called something like American Machiavelli. I thought I was going
American Bismarck.
Or American Bismarck. I thought I was going to tell the story of one of the great realists, and it became clear almost immediately that that wasn't right, and that the young Kissinger, certainly the Kissinger that grew up in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, as a Jew, as a refugee to the United States, had to start his life again, then went back to Germany in an American army uniform to fight the Nazis, and then returned to the United States to begin his academic career at Harvard. This young Kissinger was not a realist, but in fact the opposite, an idealist, immersed in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, strongly critical of the realism of the policies of the appeasement era in the 1930s, and in all the debates of the 1950s and 1960s in the early part of the Cold War, Kissinger was always on the idealist side, arguing that we should resist communism wherever it seeks to expand. So This book tells the reader a very new story, and rather a surprising story, about the first half of Kissinger's life.
There's someone call it a revisionist biography.
I've always believed one should be a revisionist. There's no point in writing history that's been written before. So yes, this is definitely a new and, I think, a plausible account of his early life, his formative years.
So would you identify your definition of idealist?
Well, I think it has three
You
components.
are a historian, so your definition of idealist, is it
Yes.
slightly different from the well-known, like Woodrow Wilson's version?
Right, although there is a connection to it. I mean, partly we need to remember that he starts out as a philosopher, writing about the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And so as a young scholar at Harvard, he's clearly in the idealist tradition of philosophy. Secondly, when he looks back on his experiences in the 1930s and 1940s, Kissinger was a critic of those people who had tried to appease Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain and the other politicians of the 1930s. And he says in an early letter, they thought of themselves as hard-headed realists. That is not intended as a compliment. But the key point is that in the debates on the Cold War, there were those like Hans Morgenthau who said, there's no point the United States fighting in Vietnam. It doesn't have any strategic value. Let it go. Kissinger was on the other side of those arguments. He believed that communism was as dangerous a threat as Nazism had been, and that American freedoms needed to be defended, even in South Vietnam, as well as in Europe. So I think it's very clear that in the debates of the 1950s and 1960s, Kissinger's on the side of the idealists who see the Cold War as being about individual freedom, who see the Cold War as an ideological struggle with Soviet communism. So I don't think it's true that he was a realist in his early life. A lot of people, I think, have been confused because they haven't read closely what he wrote as a young academic. They think that he was an admirer of Bismarck, but I show that that's not right. Kissinger wrote a book about Bismarck that was never published. I found the manuscript in his papers, incomplete, filled with crossings out and corrections. And that manuscript is very interesting because it reveals that he was a critic of Bismarck. He certainly did not want to be the American Bismarck. In fact, the key argument he makes in the 1960s is that Bismarck's cynical realism was ultimately sterile and self-defeating and led Germany, in the end, down a disastrous path. So I think this is a really important contribution, and we can no longer argue that Henry Kissinger is an American Bismarck. I think that was never true.
Okay, but interestingly, you've mentioned that if the sequel of this book, Volume 2, would be possibly entitled The Realist.
I don't think I'll call it that, and although some people probably expect it, I rather prefer a subtitle like The Realm of Power, because what happens in Kissinger's life is that in 1969 he enters the realm of power. He accepts Richard Nixon's offer of the job of National Security Advisor, and from then until 1977 he is in Washington D.C. or flying around the world making decisions of global significance. But he's in the realm of power. It's no longer academia, it's no longer about books and articles, it's about decision making, and I think that did change him. And a central theme of Volume 2 is going to be, this is what happens when an intellectual leaves the academic sphere and enters the realm of power. It's suddenly much harder to be an idealist. You have to compromise.
1949年，中华人民共和国成立后，因为意识形态和冷战的关系，中美之间外交关系中断。这种状态持续了20年，直到20世纪70年代，时任尼克松政府开始考虑与中国恢复外交关系。幕后推手之一正是尼克松的国家安全顾问亨利·基辛格。1923年，基辛格出生在德国一个犹太家庭。1938年，受纳粹迫害，基辛格逃亡到美国。2战期间应召入伍，与纳粹作战。战后，基辛格回到美国，被哈佛大学录取，开始学习国际关系，逐渐显露出他在这一领域的天赋，直至成为该领域的著名教授。 1961年，他从学术圈转向政坛，曾先后担任肯尼迪总统的外交政策顾问，林登·约翰逊总统的非官方高级顾问，并在1967年尼克松总统上任时担任国家安全顾问，在外交领域拥有重大发言权。重建与中国关系的愿望来自对苏联施压的战略必要性。基辛格在一份备忘录当中向总统报告，这可能是他们双方都能从中受益的机会。为推动美中两国建交，基辛格多次秘密赴华，也曾与周恩来总理商谈，为毛泽东和尼克松的会晤做铺垫。1972年2月21号，美国总统尼克松抵达北京。2月28号，中美上海联合公报发表，宣告中美两国关系走向正常化。从此，中华人民共和国和美利坚合众国的关系进入了一个新的历史时期。基辛格是中美两国建交的推动者和见证者，也对美国过去半个世纪的外交走向发挥了重要影响。尽管如今已年过90，仍活跃在世界政治舞台，并多次来华与中国政要及学者等人进行交流。
You know, Kissinger was highly admired in China because he's the icebreaker, the peace envoy, and the founder of the diplomatic relationship between U.S. and China. And do you think it's an idealist action, or it's just a real politique?
I think that's
measurement?
A great question and a central question for Volume 2. Why was it that Richard Nixon, who had built his reputation as an anti-communist in the late 1940s and 1950s, ended up in 1972 flying to Beijing and making a kind of peace with Mao Zedong? Kissinger was the architect of the beginning of a relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. Was this completely cynical realism aimed mainly at the Soviet Union, or was it something more profound than that? And it's certainly the most important moment in Volume 2, because I think this was a decision that changed the world. It fundamentally altered the geopolitics of the Cold War.
And also shaped the geopolitics in next, shaped the world order in next maybe 25 years.
I think it was the thing that changed the direction of Chinese history too.
Of course.
And as we sit here having a conversation like this, in some ways, we are the heirs of what happened in the early 1970s. So I think it was partly designed as an act of realpolitik. Nixon and Kissinger together understood that if the United States could improve its relationship with China, that would put pressure on the Soviet Union, which was at this point in conflict with China, and it would strengthen the United States' position in the Cold War, number one. Number two, they hoped that it would help them in Vietnam. They both knew they had to get the United States out of Vietnam, and they understood that they could get help from China in that process. So you could say that this was just a power political calculation, and some of their critics, like, for example, William F. Buckley, a conservative journalist, called them cynical and unprincipled for going and dealing with Mao at a time when China was in the grip of the Cultural Revolution. But I think it wasn't just a purely cynical act, because I think Kissinger understood almost as soon as he met Zhou Enlai that the future of China was one of the most profound questions of the modern world. And in opening the relationship between the United States and China, he was doing more than just helping American foreign policy. I think he understood that there was something that was transformative for world order itself. Bringing China back into the international system was going to change the balance of power and, Kissinger believed, increase the probability of peace. Remember, we forget this now, but for most of the Cold War, there was a very serious risk of a hot war, of World War III, an atomic world war that would have been catastrophic for mankind. Those who criticize Kissinger, I think, often forget that the ultimate goal of his policy was to avoid World War III. And I think he understood the opening to China as being a step to reduce the risk of that catastrophic nuclear war. And one has to acknowledge that the risk of World War III went down during Kissinger's time in office, and the more that the US and China dealt with one another, I think the more stable the world order became. After he left power in 1977 and returned to being essentially a writer and thinker, he consistently argued that this was about enhancing global stability and reducing the risk of conflict. And I think from that vantage point, it was more than just cynical realpolitik.
And he made it.
Absolutely.
And keep writing his books. I remember his the world order was his 34th or something, 34th books. He's a very diligent.
He's still writing at nearly at the age of 95. The man is still productive. His brain is still extraordinarily sharp. And I think what's very clear when you read the book you've just mentioned, World Order, published just a few years ago, there is an interesting coherence in his line of argument that goes all the way back to his very first book, A World Restored, published in the 1950s. And that argument is that world order, which means in effect peace, the avoidance of major conflict, is perhaps the ultimate benefit that statesmen can give mankind. Because what is more catastrophic than war? Of course, small wars happened, but the ultimate goal of policy in the United States in the early 1970s was to end the biggest war of that time, which was the Vietnam War. And although it was not done easily, and although in the end it was not done with much honor because South Vietnam was gone by 1975, Kissinger and Nixon succeeded in ending the Vietnam War and getting the United States out of Indochina. So I do think that there is an argument to be made, and I'll be making it in Volume 2, that on balance the ultimate goal of increasing order and reducing conflict was achieved, and that was a moral policy. It wasn't just an act of cynicism.